The day Monroe Barker rode into Juniper Creek, the whole town already knew something he did not, and that particular piece of knowledge would change the entire course of his life before the summer sun set behind the Colorado Rockies. It was the summer of 1874, and Juniper Creek sat like a dust-blown jewel in the valley between two great ridges of the Rocky Mountain Range. A town of roughly 400 souls who had carved their existence out of raw earth and stubborn hope. The streets were wide enough for a cattle drive to pass through without trampling more than a few fence posts, and the buildings that lined them were the usual mix of weathered timber, adobe, and the occasional proud brick facade belonging to someone who had struck enough silver or cattle money to afford permanence. The general store, the livery, the saloon with its perpetually swinging doors, the church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, the land office where men came to plant their dreams into official paper, and tucked at the end of the main street like an afterthought, the small but tidy office of the only physician in 30 miles. Monroe was 32 years old, tall in the way that men who spend most of their lives on horseback tend to be, with shoulders broad enough to cast genuine shadow and hands that bore the particular rough texture of someone who had known wire fences, branding irons, and rain-soaked leather reins for the better part of 15 years. His face was the kind of face the Colorado sun had worked on slowly and deliberately, leaving lines that told stories at the corners of his dark brown eyes, a jaw that was square without being brutish, and a permanent slight squint that came not from suspicion, but from years of scanning long horizons for cattle that had no intention of being found easily. He wore his dark hat low and rode his buckskin mare Daisy, with the easy confidence of someone who has made peace with the fact that life on horseback is simply life. He had come to Juniper Creek because a man named Calvin Trent, who ran the largest cattle operation in the valley, had sent word that he needed a capable foreman. Monroe had worked as a ranch hand, a trail driver, and briefly as a deputy marshal over in Pueblo before deciding that law work suited men with either more patience or less conscience than himself. Cattle work was honest. You knew where you stood with cattle. They did not lie to you. They did not promise things they could not deliver. And when they gave you trouble, at least it was a straightforward kind of trouble. He rode into town on a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning where the sky was that particular shade of blue that looks painted, and the air still carried the cool memory of the night before even as the sun climbed toward its work. He pulled Daisy up outside the general store to get his bearings and tie off for a moment, and that was when he heard it. Two women were standing on the porch of the store, one of them the shopkeeper's wife, a round-faced woman named Hazel Drummond, who Monroe would later learn knew the business of every living soul within 20 miles, and the other a younger woman he did not recognize. They were speaking in that particular tone women use when they are discussing something they have discussed many times before but still find worth discussing. "I do not understand it," Hazel was saying, shaking her head with the slow gravity of someone delivering judgment on a matter of great community importance. "Every single girl in this valley has been married off. Every one. Mary Hutchins, gone to the Bower boy. Clara Fields, married last October to that surveyor from Denver. Even young Edith Pryor, and she could not have been more than 19. She paused for dramatic effect. Every woman in this valley is spoken for, every one except Augusta." The younger woman, who turned out to be a visiting cousin from Glenwood Springs, asked the obvious question. "And why not Augusta?" Hazel Drummond sucked in a breath like someone about to deliver a sermon. "Because Augusta Wainwright is the most stubborn, most capable, most entirely self-sufficient woman this valley has ever produced, and every man who has tried to court her has walked away either thoroughly humbled or thoroughly confused. She does not need a husband, or so she says, and I believe her, which is the problem." Monroe, who had absolutely no business listening to this conversation, found himself listening anyway. He told himself it was because he was new and needed information about the community. That was a lie, but it was a comfortable one. She runs her father's medical practice, Hazel continued, lowering her voice by a degree that somehow made it carry farther. Old Dr. Wainwright passed 2 winters ago, God rest him. Left the whole thing to Augusta. She learned everything he knew. People come from 3 counties over. She sets bones, delivers babies, mixes medicine. She does not need a husband because she does not need anything from anybody, and that, my dear, is both her greatest strength and her greatest tragedy. Monroe untied Daisy, gave her a pat on the neck that was more for his own steadying than for hers, and rode on toward the Trent ranch without looking back at the store porch. But the name stayed with him, Augusta Wainwright. He rolled it around in his mind the way you roll a smooth river stone between your fingers, not sure why you picked it up, but unwilling to put it down just yet. The Trent ranch spread across the eastern slope of the valley like something a man had drawn on a map after a very good day, nearly 800 acres of grass and stream and good grazing land. Calvin Trent himself was 58, a man who had built all of it himself over 30 years, and who had the quiet authority of someone who has never had to raise his voice because things simply went the way he intended them to go. He had white hair, a white mustache, and blue eyes that missed nothing. He met Monroe at the gate, shook his hand with the grip of a man 20 years younger, and said, "You come well recommended, Barker. Holt Mitchell over in Pueblo says you are the best judge of cattle and the best judge of men he has ever employed, and Holt Mitchell is not a man who throws compliments around carelessly." "Holt is generous," Monroe said. "Holt is accurate," Calvin replied. "Come inside. We will talk terms and you can meet the crew." The crew was 12 men, ranging from an 18-year-old named Billy Cope, who was riding his first real season as a hand, to a 50-year-old Mexican vaquero named Rafael Esparza, who had been working Trent land for 19 years and knew every inch of the valley, the way most men know their own kitchen. Rafael was the one who told Monroe the real shape of things that evening after supper, sitting on the bunkhouse steps while the mountains turned purple and gold against the fading sky. "You will hear about Augusta Wainwright," Rafael said, in the direct way he had of addressing everything. "Everyone does when they are new. She patched up 3 of our men last year. Billy Cope broke his arm falling from a green horse. Old Pete Sanderson, infection from a wire cut that would have taken his hand if she had not caught it. And Hector, you have not met him yet. He was here before me, nearly 60. She found a growth in his chest and told him honestly what it meant and then sat with him twice a week until he passed. She is not a woman to be trifled with." He said this last part with complete respect, as if he were describing a force of nature that deserved acknowledgement. "I was not planning on trifling with anyone," Monroe said. Raphael looked at him sideways with those dark, knowing eyes. "No one ever plans it." Monroe met Augusta Wainwright for the first time on the 3rd day after his arrival, and not under circumstances he would have chosen, though he would later decide that the universe had chosen better for him than he would have chosen for himself. It was a Thursday afternoon, and he had ridden out with Raphael and 2 other hands to check the fence line along the northern pasture, which had a reputation for giving way at inconvenient moments due to a combination of rocky soil and enthusiastic elk, who did not particularly respect the concept of private property. They were halfway through the inspection when the sky, which had been behaving itself admirably all morning, decided without any particular warning to drop a storm on them that had apparently been building just out of sight behind the northern ridge. It was not a gentle summer shower. It was the full theatrical production, lightning that cracked the sky open like a dropped plate, thunder that arrived not as a rumble but as an impact you felt in your chest, and rain that fell with the conviction of something that had been held back for months and was making up for lost time. They made it back to the ranch yard in various states of soaked. Raphael's horse, a steady gray mare that Monroe had thought nothing could unsettle, shied hard at a particularly close crack of lightning and put Raphael on the ground at a speed that suggested Raphael had never agreed to this arrangement. He landed badly, left ankle twisted beneath him, and the sound he made was not a scream, because Raphael was not a man who screamed, but it was the sharp, controlled exhale of a man in real pain doing his best not to show it. Monroe was off daisy before anyone else had fully processed what happened. He got down beside Raphael, assessed quickly with the kind of calm that genuine emergencies tend to produce in people who are built for them, and said, "We need the doctor." "Dr. Wainwright," Billy Cope said, already moving toward the barn for a fresh horse. "She is in town. I will go." "Go fast," Monroe said, and helped Raphael into the bunkhouse out of the rain. She arrived 20 minutes later, which Monroe would later understand was genuinely fast considering the road from town to the Trent Ranch in wet conditions. And she arrived not in a buggy but on horseback. A dark bay gelding she rode with the comfortable competence of someone who had been making this trip in all weathers for years, her medical bag strapped securely behind the saddle. Monroe saw her through the bunkhouse window first, and he stood there for exactly 1 second longer than he should have before going out to meet her, because the sight of her needed that second of processing. Augusta Wainwright was 27 years old, though she carried herself with the self-possessed bearing of someone who had long since stopped measuring themselves against their age and simply measured themselves against their own considerable standards. She was not conventionally beautiful in the way the popular lithographs of the era tended to portray women, with their soft curls and decorative helplessness. She was striking, which was different, and in Monroe's private estimation significantly better. Her dark hair was pinned practically at the base of her neck, with no concession to fashion. Her eyes were a very particular shade of gray-green that the mountains sometimes turned in early spring, and they were looking at everything around her with the quick professional focus of someone who has already begun working before they have reached the patient. She wore a plain deep blue dress that was practical in cut and entirely without ornament, and she moved with the directness of someone who has never once entered a room wondering whether she had the right to be there. She walked past Monroe, who had stepped out to greet her, with a nod that acknowledged his existence while clearly prioritizing Raphael's ankle, and Monroe found himself falling into step behind her with no plan to do so and no particular ability to do otherwise. "Raphael Esparza," she said, coming through the bunkhouse door and going directly to where he was sitting with his boot already removed by Monroe's instruction. "I told you last spring you were riding too fast on wet ground." "Good afternoon to you too, Dr. Wainwright," Raphael said, with the ghost of a smile. "Good afternoon," she replied, already crouching down, already running her hands along the ankle with a thoroughness that was also somehow gentle. "When did it happen?" Monroe answered before Raphael could, because Raphael was busy trying not to wince. "About 40 minutes ago. He came down fast, landed on the outside of the ankle." She glanced up at Monroe then. It was the first time their eyes met properly, and Monroe would remember it for the rest of his life with a clarity that surprised him. Her gray-green eyes assessed him in exactly the same efficient way they had assessed the ankle, taking information, filing it, making a quick and competent judgment, and then moving on. "You are new," she said. It was not a question. "Monroe Barker," he said. "New foreman." "You kept him still and got him in out of the rain," she said. "Good instincts." Then she returned her full attention to Raphael, and Monroe had the distinct sensation of a door closing, not unkindly, just very specifically. She worked with a quiet, efficient economy that he found himself watching more than he intended to. Her hands were certain. She spoke to Raphael throughout, explaining what she was finding and what she was going to do, which he realized was not something all doctors did, and which made Raphael's shoulders come down from around his ears by degrees. The ankle was badly sprained and had one small bone at the edge that she suspected was cracked but not broken through, and she splinted it, wrapped it, gave Raphael a preparation of willow bark for the pain, and left instructions for elevation and cool cloths that were detailed enough to constitute a small medical education. When she finished, she packed her bag with the same efficient calm she had unpacked it, and Monroe walked out with her to where her gelding was standing patiently at the post. The rain had stopped. The air smelled like wet earth and pine, and something that was simply the mountains releasing a long-held breath. "What do I owe you?" Monroe asked, because Calvin Trent was in town and someone needed to conduct the business of the thing. "Calvin knows my rates," she said, untying her gelding. "He will settle it next time he is in." "He is a fair man," Monroe said. "Yes," she agreed. She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up with the ease of someone who has done it 10,000 times, then looked down at him from the saddle. "You were right to get him inside and keep him still. A lot of men would have tried to make him walk it off." "Walking off a broken bone generally makes the bone worse," Monroe said. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but the premise of one. "That is exactly right, Mr. Barker." She gathered her reins. "Welcome to Juniper Creek." She rode out of the yard, and Monroe stood there watching until the dark bay gelding rounded the bend in the road and disappeared. And then he stood there a moment longer, just listening to the sound of the hooves fading and the post-storm silence filling back in around it. Behind him, from the bunkhouse doorway, he heard Raphael's voice, dry as summer grass. "No one ever plans it," Raphael said, and Monroe could hear the smile in it without turning around. "Go elevate your ankle," Monroe said, and went to find Daisy in the barn. The following weeks settled into the rhythm of the summer cattle work, which was demanding and constant in the way that good hard work tends to be, filling the days so completely that there is no space for anything else during the daylight hours, and leaving the evenings with a bone-deep tiredness that should have produced dreamless sleep. Monroe's evenings, however, were increasingly occupied by a mind that had developed the inconvenient habit of circling back to a pair of gray-green eyes and a pair of efficient hands that knew exactly what they were doing. He told himself this was foolish. He was new to the valley, he had a job to do, and more to the point, he had heard the testimony of Hazel Drummond with his own ears on his very first morning, and had no reason to doubt it. Augusta Wainwright was not a woman looking for a husband. She was a woman who had built something real and substantial with her own hands and her own mind, and the last thing she needed was some new-arrived cowboy assuming that what she lacked was a man in her life. He told himself this very logically on approximately 7 separate occasions, and on each occasion his mind listened attentively and then went right back to thinking about her. His next encounter with her came not at the ranch but in town, on a Saturday afternoon when he had ridden in to collect supplies for the bunkhouse. He was coming out of the general store with a sack of coffee and a pound of salt, squinting against the afternoon glare, when he nearly walked directly into her, which would have been a genuinely embarrassing collision given the coffee situation. "Mr. Barker," she said, stepping to the side with the quick reflexes of someone accustomed to moving in tight spaces. "Dr. Wainwright," he said, managing to keep the coffee and his dignity simultaneously intact. "I apologize, I was not watching where I was going." "Neither was I," she said, which was generous of her because from the direction she had come, she clearly had been watching where she was going and had avoided the collision entirely through her own competence. "How is Raphael's ankle?" "Healing well. He is walking carefully but walking. He asks me to tell you he is following your instructions, which I can confirm is only about 70% accurate, but the important parts, the elevation and the rest, he is doing." She nodded. "Tell him the important parts are the ones that matter." There was a pause, the kind of pause that forms when two people are about to go in different directions and haven't quite committed to it yet. Monroe, who had not planned to say anything further, heard himself say, "I wondered if I might ask you something, Dr. Wainwright, if you have a moment." She looked at him with that efficient assessment. "You may ask. I am new to this valley, and I want to understand the land and the people in it, because understanding that is part of my job and part of being a decent neighbor. I have been talking to the men at the ranch and to Calvin, but I get the sense that you know this valley and everyone in it probably better than anyone. I wondered if you would be willing to talk to me sometime. Not as a patient," he added quickly, because he could see a certain professional distance beginning to gather in her expression. just as someone who knows things and might be willing to share knowledge with someone who is trying to learn. She looked at him for a moment longer than the previous assessments had taken. He had the sense of being genuinely considered rather than just categorized, which was different and somehow more nerve-wracking. "I have coffee at my office most mornings before the patients arrive," she said finally. "If you are in town before 8, you are welcome to share a cup. I make no promises about how much time I will have, but the offer stands." "I appreciate it," he said. She gave him one of those not-quite smiles again and went into the general store, and Monroe walked to Daisy feeling considerably more pleased with himself than the situation strictly warranted. He came the next Tuesday morning, because Calvin had business in town and Monroe could ride in with him without it looking like the visit was the purpose rather than the business. He tied Daisy outside the small office at the end of the main street and knocked on the door, which was already open in the early morning air at 7:45. She called for him to come in, and he stepped into a space that was unlike any doctor's office he had been in before, which admittedly was not a long list, but the comparison was still striking. It was ordered in the way that intense minds tend to order things, not always conventionally but always functionally, every item in its place but the places determined by use rather than appearance. There were shelves of glass jars containing preparations and medicines with labels in small, precise handwriting. There was a cabinet with a glass front that held surgical instruments cleaned and organized with the kind of care you gave to things that mattered. There was a desk covered in papers and a well-worn medical textbook open on the corner that she had clearly been reading before he arrived. There was a small wood stove with a coffee pot on it that smelled like the best thing that had happened to him in recent memory. She was standing at the desk making a note in a ledger, and she did not stop immediately, which he did not mind. He looked around the room while she finished, and what he saw told him more about her than any conversation could have. On the wall behind the desk there was a framed certificate, her father's medical certificate from a school in Philadelphia, and beside it, in a smaller frame, a handwritten document that he looked at more closely and found was a letter from a medical society in Denver, acknowledging receipt of her request for membership, and he could see from the tone of it before he stopped reading because it was not his business, declining it on the grounds that the society did not admit women. The fact that she had framed the rejection rather than burned it told him everything about the kind of spine she had. "Coffee," she said, putting down her pen and going to the stove. "Thank you," he said. "That letter on your wall from the Denver Society." She poured 2 cups and handed him one, and there was a moment where he thought she might close the subject. Instead, she looked at the framed letter with the expression of someone who has long since made their peace with something without quite forgiving it. "My father's colleague wrote it. He considered himself a fair man. He was not, in that particular instance, a fair man." She sipped her coffee. "I keep it there to remind myself that the opinion of people who have not examined the evidence is not the same as the evidence itself." Monroe looked at the letter and then at her. "Your patients do not seem to share their opinion." "No," she said. "My patients judge by results, which is, in the end, the only judgment that is honest." They talked for an hour that morning, covering the valley, its history, its geography, the families in it, the particular challenges of medicine in a place this remote, the cattle industry, the changes that were coming with the railroad pushing further west each year, the question of what Juniper Creek would look like in another decade. She was the most genuinely interesting person he had talked to in years, possibly ever, and when the first patient knocked on the door at 8:50 and Monroe stood to leave, he felt the hour ending with the particular reluctance you feel when a very good book closes. "Thank you," he said at the door. "Come back Thursday if you like," she said, already moving toward her patient. "I have better coffee than the saloon and the conversation is considerably more intelligent." He came back Thursday, and the following Tuesday, and the Thursday after that. Within a month, it had become a genuine and established routine, so much so that when he missed a Tuesday because a section of fence had come down in a windstorm overnight and it took the whole day to deal with it, he rode into town the next morning specifically to apologize for not showing up, which made her blink at him for a moment with an expression he could not quite read. "You do not owe me an apology for missing coffee," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to give you one anyway." She looked at him for a moment. "Sit down, Monroe," she said, which was the first time she had used his given name, and he sat, and the morning continued as if nothing had shifted, but something had shifted, and they both knew it, even if neither of them said so. The community of Juniper Creek had opinions about the developing situation, because communities of 400 people in 1874 had opinions about everything, and invested in those opinions with considerable enthusiasm. Hazel Drummond at the general store was tracking the development with the focused intensity of a naturalist observing a rare migration. She reported to various interested parties that Monroe Barker was seen at Augusta Wainwright's office on Tuesday and Thursday mornings on a regular basis. The interested parties had strong feelings. Margaret Holt, who was 60 and had known Augusta since she was born, said it was about time, and she hoped Monroe was made of sturdier stuff than the previous candidates. Frank Drummond, Hazel's husband, said he reckoned Augusta would eat the man alive if he stepped wrong. Calvin Trent, when Monroe mentioned one evening that he had been talking with the doctor regularly and found her knowledge of the valley invaluable, looked at his new foreman with the wise eyes of a man who has lived long enough to recognize what people tell themselves when they are not yet ready to tell themselves the truth, and said simply, "She is the finest woman in this valley, Monroe. You would do well to remember that." Monroe said he had no doubt of it. Calvin said, "No, I do not think you have any doubt of it at all," and changed the subject to cattle prices, which Monroe was grateful for. The change came in the way that changes in genuine relationships often come, not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual accumulation of small moments that reach a tipping point. And the particular Tuesday morning in late August when it tipped for Monroe was not remarkable by any external measure. He arrived at the office to find Augusta sitting at her desk, not reading the textbook and not writing in the ledger, but simply sitting, looking at nothing, with an expression on her face that was the first truly unguarded thing he had seen on her face in the 10 weeks he had known her. He said nothing. He went to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee and brought them both over and set one in front of her and sat down across from her without asking what was wrong, because he had learned that she did not appreciate being asked what was wrong until she had decided to tell you. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. The morning light came through the window behind her desk and turned the edges of her hair warm. She said, quietly and without preamble, "I lost a patient last night. A woman, 41 years old, difficult delivery, and there was nothing I could do. I knew there was nothing I could do from early on, and I still sat there with her for 11 hours trying to do it." She paused. Her name was Clara Marsh. She has 3 older children and a husband who is a decent man, and this morning I had to tell him. Monroe held his coffee cup and said nothing because there was nothing to say. Some things did not get better with words. He knew that, and more importantly, he had learned that she knew that he knew it, which was why she was telling him. After a moment she said, "I know the medicine. I know exactly what happened and why. That is what my father told me would be the hardest part. You know the anatomy, you know the physiology, you understand the failure with absolute clarity, and the clarity does not make it smaller." "No," Monroe said. "It just makes it more precise." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "exactly that." They sat there in the morning light and drank their coffee, and the silence between them had the quality of something comfortable and essential, the kind of silence that 2 people can only share if they have, without particularly trying to, become genuinely important to each other. He rode back to the ranch that morning thinking about her with a clarity that had nothing to do with confusion. He was in love with Augusta Wainwright. He was not heading toward it, and he was not in the early stages of it. He was simply in it, had been in it for some time, and the only question was what to do about it, given everything he knew about her. What he knew about her was this: she was brilliant and capable and deeply private. She had built something real and valuable in a world that tried at every turn to tell her she could not and should not. She had watched men try to court her and found them wanting, not because she was unreasonably demanding, but because the men who had tried had wanted a version of her that did not exist, a softer version, a smaller version, a version willing to put away her work and her independence and her refusal to be less than she was. She had said no to all of them, and she had been right too. He lay in his bunk that night listening to Billy Cope's uncomplicated snoring and thought about whether he was different from those other men, and he tried to be genuinely honest with himself about it, which is the only kind of honesty that counts. He did not want her to be smaller or softer. He did not want her to put away her work. He did not think she needed him at all, practically speaking, which was both the point and the source of the particular ache that had settled in his chest somewhere around week 6 of Tuesday and Thursday mornings. He did not want her to need him. He wanted her to choose him, which was an entirely different thing, and one he could not manufacture by being useful or clever or present. He decided the only honest thing to do was to tell her the truth and let her make of it whatever she would. He told her on the last day of August, which in 1874 in the Colorado Rockies was already beginning to have that edge of chill in the early morning air that reminded you autumn was not far behind. He arrived at the office before she was quite ready, and she looked at him when he came in with that particular look that had become the morning greeting, a quick, honest assessment that always resolved itself in recent weeks into something warmer than it had been in the early days. He sat down. She poured the coffee. He said, without any particular prelude, because he had discovered over the summer that Augusta Wainwright appreciated people who got to the point, "I need to tell you something, and I want you to hear it out before you respond to it." She sat down across from him with her coffee and gave him her full attention in that particular way she had, which was both encouraging and slightly terrifying. "I came to Juniper Creek to do a job," he said. "And I have been doing it, and I intend to keep doing it. But what has happened over this summer, these Tuesday and Thursday mornings, is that I have come to know you, and I know you better now than I have known most people I have spent years with. You are the most extraordinary person I have ever met, Augusta. Not because you are a woman who has done something remarkable, though that is true, but because you are a person who is honest in a way that most people are not, who thinks in a way that is real and clear, and who is kinder than you let most people see. I am in love with you. I have been for some time. I am not telling you this because I want anything from you or because I expect anything. I am telling you because you deserve to know the truth about where I stand, and because I think you are someone who would rather have the honest truth than a comfortable uncertainty." He picked up his coffee. "That is what I needed to say." The office was very quiet. The coffee pot ticked as it cooled on the stove. Outside on the main street, someone drove a wagon past that rattled slightly on the dry ruts. Augusta looked at him for a long moment with those gray-green eyes that he could not read. Then she said, "How long have you known?" "Since about the 4th Tuesday," he said. "I spent several more weeks arguing with myself about it." "And the argument lost," she said. "Comprehensively," he said. She was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet than the one before he spoke. She turned her coffee cup in her hands, which was the only outward evidence of any interior turbulence, because Augusta Wainwright's composure was considerable. "I have sent away 4 men who came to call in the past 5 years," she said. "Not because I did not understand what they were offering, because what they were offering was a trade, my practice for their name, my independence for their comfort. They were decent men, most of them, but they wanted me to be something I could not be." She looked up at him. "You have never once suggested I should be anything other than what I am." "You should never be anything other than what you are," he said. "That would be a genuine tragedy for everyone, including me." "I do not know," she said slowly, whether I am capable of what you are describing. I have arranged my life around myself and my work for a very long time, Monroe, and I am honest enough to tell you that I cannot promise to be easy or uncomplicated. I have been working with cattle for 15 years, he said. I have no expectation that valuable things are easy or uncomplicated. Something happened in her eyes then, something that opened rather than closing, and she said, with a small and genuine smile that was different from all the not-quite smiles he had collected over the summer, "Then I suppose we might try." What followed was not the straightforward progress of a simple courtship, because nothing about two people who are both genuinely themselves ever is. Augusta did not transform. She remained who she was, which Monroe had never wanted her to change. She kept her hours, her patience, her difficult cases in the middle of the night when someone's child spiked a dangerous fever or a ranch hand took a bad fall, and Monroe kept his hours and his cattle and his long days in the field. But between those two separate, complete lives, something wove itself together with a patience and a thoroughness that Monroe had not expected, and that Augusta, he suspected, found considerably more alarming than she let on. He began to find small ways to be present that did not intrude. He rode into town with fresh herbs from the kitchen garden at the Trent Ranch whenever he knew she had asked for them, because she had mentioned once that fresh herbs made certain preparations more effective, and the supply was often inconsistent. He read, which he had always done in the evenings, but now he read things she found interesting, and they discussed them on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and the discussions were better than anything he had experienced in a reading room or a classroom. He fixed the hinge on her office door that had been stiff since he first arrived, not making an announcement of it, just fixing it one morning while she was with a patient and leaving without mention. She noticed everything. She said nothing about most of it, but she noticed. She, in turn, gave him things she had not given the previous candidates, small pieces of herself that she usually kept in reserve. She told him about her father, who had taught her medicine with a seriousness and completeness that was itself a kind of love, who had believed in a completely matter-of-fact way that his daughter's mind was exactly as capable as any man's, and had therefore taught it with exactly the same rigor, and expected exactly the same results. She told him about the loneliness of the 2 years since her father died, not the functional loneliness of a woman without a husband, which was what people assumed she must feel, but the specific loneliness of someone who had lost the one person who had always understood how her mind worked. She told him about the cases that stayed with her, the ones that went wrong and the ones that went right, and he listened to all of it with the focused attention of someone to whom the topic is genuinely interesting rather than something to be politely endured. He told her about his own history, the family in Missouri he had left at 18, because the farm was not going to survive, and there were enough mouths without his. The trail drives, the marshal work, the particular education of having lived without a fixed place for 15 years, and what it had taught him about what he actually wanted from a life. He told her about his mother, who had died when he was 24, which he had not been there for, which still sat in him as a specific weight he carried carefully. He told her things he had not told anyone, and found that she received them with the same directness she received everything else, not with manufactured sympathy, but with genuine engagement. By October they were walking together on Sunday afternoons, which in a town the size of Juniper Creek was as public a declaration as either of them was likely to make short of an actual announcement. Hazel Drummond observed this development from the store porch with visible satisfaction. Calvin Trent said nothing, but found reasons to not need Monroe on Sunday afternoons. Raphael Esparza, whose ankle had healed entirely in the timeline doctor, Wainwright had predicted, watched Monroe saddle up on Sunday mornings with the expression of a man who has been right about something for months, and is too dignified to say so, but is quite pleased with himself. Margaret Holt, who was 60 and had known Augusta since her birth, met Monroe on the street one Sunday morning in early October and stopped him with the kind of authority that only certain older women possess, a complete and unquestioned expectation that you will stop and attend to what they have to say. "Monroe Barker," she said, looking up at him from her 5 feet and 2 inches of considerable personal presence. "I have known Augusta Wainwright since she came into this world. Her mother was my closest friend and died too young. I have watched that girl grow into that woman, and I have watched every man who tried to approach her walk away confused because they came wanting something from her that she was not willing to give, which was the smaller version of herself." She looked at him sharply. "You are not doing that." "No, ma'am," he said. "She is laughing more," Margaret said, as if this were a medical report she was delivering. "I have not heard her laugh that easily in 2 years, not since her father passed. Whatever you are doing, Monroe Barker, you are doing it right." She patted his arm once with a firm hand. "Do not stop." He said he had no intention of stopping. The Sunday walks became something both of them looked forward to, with an anticipation that grew rather than diminished with repetition, which Monroe privately recognized as a very good sign. They walked the valley in all the moods of the autumn, which in the Colorado Rockies put on a performance that deserved better than just observation, the aspens turning their specific heartbreaking gold against the dark green of the pines, the sky going that deep, impossible blue that comes with altitude and changing seasons, the air sharpening by degrees until your breath showed and your cheeks stung pleasantly. On a Sunday in early November, they were walking the trail along the creek south of town, the water running low and clear over its rocky bed, the aspens mostly bare now, and the light coming through them at a low slanted angle that turned everything gold and quiet. Augusta had her coat buttoned high and her hands in her pockets, and they were talking about nothing in particular, which had become one of their best modes of conversation, when she stopped walking and turned to look at the creek for a moment without speaking. Monroe stopped beside her and looked at the water too. "My father used to bring me here," she said. "We would collect plant specimens. He was interested in what the local plants could do medicinally that the Eastern preparations could not. We spent entire afternoons out here with my notebook and his collecting jars." She paused. "I have not come back here since he died. I thought it would be sad." "Is it?" Monroe asked. She thought about it. "No," she said, with something like surprise in her voice. "It is not sad at all." She looked at the water for another moment, and then she looked at him, and the look on her face was entirely open in a way he had seen very rarely, the composed professional efficiency entirely put aside. "I did not know I was lonely," she said quietly. "I was so busy, there was so much to do, and I had convinced myself that self-sufficiency was the same as contentment. And then you arrived and started coming to drink coffee with me twice a week, and I realized that I had been lonely for a very long time and had simply declined to notice." Monroe turned to face her fully. The creek made its small, persistent sound beside them. "You do not have to be lonely anymore," he said. "No," she agreed. "I do not think I do." He reached out and took her hand, which was the first time he had done so, and she let him, which was not nothing from Augusta Wainwright. They stood there beside the creek her father had brought her to, holding hands in the November light, and the valley spread out around them with its mountains and its sky and its particular honest beauty. And Monroe thought with a sudden fierce clarity that he had ridden into this valley as a man passing through the world, and he was not passing through any more. He proposed in December, on a Tuesday morning in her office, with the wood stove burning and the coffee made, and the mountain winter pressing white and silent against the windows. He had thought about elaborate gestures and dismissed them, because elaborate gestures were not what Augusta Wainwright would appreciate. He had thought about a ring and had gone to the general store and looked at what was available and had, after considerable deliberation, chosen one, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone that was local, found in the mountains near Juniper Creek by a miner who sold his small discoveries to the store rather than filing major claims, and the blue-green of the stone was approximately the color of her eyes in certain lights. He took the small velvet-wrapped package from his coat pocket and set it on the desk in front of her without any theatrical presentation, and she looked at it and then at him, and he said, "I would like to spend the rest of my life having coffee with you on Tuesday and Thursday mornings and every other morning besides, and walking with you on Sundays, and listening to you think out loud about your work, and being the person you tell things to when they are hard. I love you, Augusta. I would like very much if you would marry me." She picked up the small package and unwrapped it slowly, and when she saw the ring she held it for a moment and looked at the stone with that private close attention she gave to things she was genuinely moved by. Then she looked up at him and her eyes were bright in a way he had not seen before. "The turquoise is local," he said. "I thought you would prefer something that belonged to this place." "I do," she said. She set the ring down on the desk and looked at him seriously. "I want to keep my practice. I want to keep my name professionally. I am Dr. Wainwright to my patients and I need to remain so." "Of course," he said, without hesitation, because this was not a point to hesitate on. "I may be called out at any hour," she said. "There will be nights I am not home. There will be hard days and days I am not good company." "Augusta," he said, "I work cattle. I am not home half the time myself. We will work it out." She picked up the ring again, and then she did something he did not expect. She smiled, not the not-quite smile or the professional small smile, but a full and genuine and radiant smile that rearranged his understanding of what her face could do and hit him somewhere behind his sternum with considerable force. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He came around the desk and she stood, and he put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it on her hand with an expression he could only describe as wondering, like someone who has found something they had stopped looking for so long ago that finding it requires a moment of adjustment. He kissed her then, the first time he had kissed her, and she kissed him back with the same directness and completeness that she brought to everything she did. And the coffee pot sat on the stove, and the winter pressed against the windows, and Juniper Creek went about its Tuesday morning business entirely unaware that inside the doctor's office at the end of the main street, the last unmarried woman in the valley had just agreed to change that status, and that the man who had asked her was already composing, without quite meaning to, his daily gratitude to whatever lucky star had put him on the road to this particular valley on that particular June morning. They were married in March of 1875, when the winter was letting go and the valley was beginning its tentative return to green. The ceremony was in the church, which doubled as the schoolhouse on weekdays, and the turnout was approximately 380 of the 400 residents of Juniper Creek, plus a contingent from 3 neighboring ranches and 2 settlements further up the valley, which meant that the church was full past capacity, and the people who could not fit inside the door stood outside in the cool March air and listened through the open windows. Margaret Holt sat in the front pew and cried unashamedly, and told anyone who would listen that it was about time, and she had known from the moment she first saw Monroe Barker's face that this was a man who understood what he was looking at. Rafael Esparza stood up with Monroe as his best man, because the two of them had developed over the 9 months of Monroe's employment a friendship built on mutual respect and the shared experience of Rafael's ankle and many early mornings checking the fence line. And Rafael took the role with the dignified seriousness he brought to everything. Hazel Drummond organized the celebration afterward with the focused energy of someone who has been waiting for exactly this event for years and has been planning it in her head since approximately November. Calvin Trent shook Monroe's hand before the ceremony and said, "I am glad you are staying. I had worried this past year that you might find some reason to move on." "This is where I am meant to be," Monroe said. "Yes," Calvin said, with the certainty of a man who reads the shape of things clearly. "It is." Augusta walked down the aisle on her own, because she had no father living and no brother to take his arm, and she had told Monroe when they discussed the ceremony that she preferred it that way, that she was coming to him of her own choosing and entirely on her own feet, and that seemed to her the right way to do it. She wore a dress of deep gold that her friend Clara Hutchins had helped her make, simple in cut but warm and lovely in the morning light, and she walked with the same direct, unhurried bearing she brought to everything. And Monroe stood at the front of the church and watched her come toward him, and felt something settle in his chest with a solidity that had no drama in it, just the deep, quiet certainty of a thing finally finding its right place. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Thomas Gates, who kept it to the essentials because Augusta had requested this. And when Monroe put the ring on her hand alongside the turquoise ring she was already wearing, and when she put a plain gold band on his, the watching congregation let out a collective breath that had apparently been held for the duration. The celebration after was exactly what Hazel Drummond was capable of organizing, which was considerable. Tables were set up in the street. There was food from what seemed like every kitchen in the valley. Calvin Trent provided several jugs of good whiskey, and someone produced a fiddle and a guitar, and the afternoon became an event that Juniper Creek would discuss for years. Monroe danced with Augusta, which he did adequately and she did well, and then danced with Margaret Holt, who told him he was a good man and she expected him to continue being one, which he promised to do. Augusta danced with Raphael, who turned out to be an excellent dancer despite his ankle history, and with Billy Cope, who was enthusiastic if not technically proficient, and with Calvin Trent, who was stately and proper about it. They were given a house. It was not a large house. It had been built by a mining family who had subsequently followed a better strike up the valley and been happy to sell. But it was solid and well situated, 2 streets behind the main street, close enough to Augusta's office that she could reach it quickly in the night, and with a good yard that the previous family had attempted a kitchen garden in, and that Monroe looked at with the eye of someone who knows growing things. The first months of their marriage were a revelation to Monroe that he had not quite anticipated, not because it was difficult, but because it was different from anything he had imagined when he had allowed himself to imagine it. Living with Augusta Wainwright was like living with the weather, not in the sense of being unpredictable, because she was actually considerably more consistent than the weather, but in the sense of being genuinely alive in a way that filled whatever space it occupied completely. She was quiet in the mornings before coffee and talkative after it. She read in the evenings by lamplight, often medical texts, but sometimes novels, and when she found something in a novel that struck her, she read it aloud without preamble, which Monroe found that he liked enormously. She had opinions about everything that was worth having opinions about and said them plainly, and when she was wrong she admitted it, which was the rarest and most valuable quality Monroe had ever encountered in another human being. She was also, he discovered, quietly and privately funny in a way that had not entirely surfaced in the more formal setting of Tuesday and Thursday morning coffee. She had a dry humor that operated just below the surface of her very serious professional manner, and it emerged at home in the evenings when they were simply themselves, and it delighted him every time. He was, in turn, different at home than the foreman who managed Calvin Trent's 12-man crew with quiet authority. He was gentler than she had perhaps expected, though she had read him well enough from early on that it did not entirely surprise her. He was someone who, at the end of a long physical day, still had the patience to listen carefully and the interest to engage genuinely, and she had not. She admitted to him one evening in their second month, entirely believed that was real when she first observed it. "I thought you were performing it," she said, without embarrassment. "The attentiveness. I thought it was a courtship strategy." "How long until you decided it wasn't?" he asked. She considered. "The morning I told you about Clara Marsh," she said. "You sat there and you did not say anything because there was nothing to say, and you knew that, and the knowing it was not a performance. That was when I knew you were real." "That is the nicest thing I have ever been called," he said. She gave him the full smile, the one that still hit him behind the sternum every time. "Real," she confirmed and went back to her book. Summer came, and with it the full rolling demands of cattle season, which meant Monroe was often away before dawn and not back until the light was gone, and Augusta was often called out in the night and back before he rose, and the house sometimes had the quality of a place where two people passed in and out like tides, leaving small evidence of each other. A note on the kitchen table, his boots at the door, her medical bag on the hook by the entrance, the coffee pot prepared and waiting for whoever woke first. This might have been lonely in a different configuration. In their configuration it was fine, because the time they did have was real and complete, and because both of them were people who had built their capacity for solitude into the foundation of who they were, and who could therefore be alone without being lonely, which was different from before, when Augusta had been alone and had not yet recognized the shape of the loneliness that was sitting quietly in the corner of her life. One evening in late June, Monroe came home to find Augusta sitting at the kitchen table with a medical text and a cup of cold coffee, and an expression on her face that he had learned, over the past year, meant she was working something out. He sat down across from her and waited. She looked up after a moment and said, "I believe I am going to have a child." He was quiet for a moment, taking that in with the fullness it deserved. Then he said, "Are you certain?" "I am fairly certain," she said. "Professionally speaking, I am approximately 85% certain. As a patient rather than a physician, I would say I am certain." "How are you feeling?" he asked, which was his first question because it was the right first question. She looked at him with the look that had the assessment in it, but now underneath the assessment there was something else, something open and slightly uncertain in a way she rarely showed. "I am feeling a great many things," she said. "I want you to know that I intend to keep working throughout. I have seen plenty of women manage this and manage their households, and I see no reason why I cannot manage my practice." "I would not suggest otherwise," he said. "Augusta," he reached across the table and took her hand. "I am glad," he said simply. "I am very glad." She looked at their joined hands and then at him, and the uncertainty resolved itself into something warmer. "So am I," she said. "I am finding that I am more glad than I expected to be, which tells me something about the distance between what I thought I wanted and what I actually want." "What do you actually want?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "This," she said, with a simplicity that carried everything in it. "Exactly this." Their son was born in February of 1876, which was a hard winter month in the Colorado Rockies, and the labor was long and difficult in the way that some are, and Monroe sat outside the room where Margaret Holt attended Augusta, because Augusta had requested Margaret rather than trying to manage her own delivery, which was both wise and a significant concession to her own humanity. And Monroe sat in the hallway and experienced about 12 hours of the kind of helplessness that no amount of competence or strength can address, which was its own education. When Margaret opened the door and told him he had a son and that Augusta was tired but entirely well, Monroe sat still for one moment longer than he needed to, taking a breath that was more of a release than an intake, and then he went in. Augusta was tired in a way he had never seen her, but the way she looked up when he came through the door had nothing of exhaustion in it. She had the child, red-faced and indignant about his new circumstances, held against her with the natural authority of someone whose instincts had arrived fully formed. "Come and see," she said. He came and sat beside her on the bed and looked at their son, and the boy had a very serious expression for someone who had been in the world for approximately 20 minutes, dark hair already against his small head, and enormous dark eyes that were trying to focus on the world with what appeared to be genuine annoyance at the effort. "He looks angry," Monroe said. "He will get over it," Augusta said, with the calm certainty of someone who deals with difficult patients regularly. "What shall we call him?" Monroe had not pushed the discussion of names because Augusta had said she wanted to see the child before deciding. "I have been thinking," she said, "of calling him after my father." "Edward," she looked at Monroe. "Edward Barker, if you agree." "Edward Barker," Monroe said, trying it out. He looked at the boy, who had progressed from angry to suspicious, which seemed like an improvement. "He looks like an Edward." "He does, rather," Augusta agreed. Monroe put his arm around her carefully, and she leaned against him, which was both entirely natural and somehow still surprising, that she was someone who leaned, who allowed herself to be held, who had chosen, with full knowledge and complete competence, to let another person be beside her. He thought of the first morning he had seen her ride into the Trent Ranch yard in the rain, the self-sufficient efficiency of her, the absolute completeness of a person who had arranged their life to need nothing and no one, and he thought about how wrong that had been, not in its facts. She had been entirely self-sufficient and entirely capable, but in its scope. She had always been capable of this too. She had simply not trusted anyone enough to find out. He was glad every day, with a quiet, fierce gratitude that sometimes surprised him by its intensity, that he had gotten to be the one who found out. Margaret Holt came in an hour later and held Edward with an expression of complete satisfaction and said, "He has your eyes, Monroe, and her chin, and that combination is going to give a great many people considerable trouble in about 15 years. "I look forward to it," Monroe said. Calvin Trent came by 2 days later, when Augusta was well enough for visitors, and held the boy with the awkward reverence of a man who has spent 58 years primarily dealing with cattle and found babies significantly more delicate, and said, in a voice that was quieter than his usual, "Your father would have been very pleased, Augusta." She smiled at that, the full one. "Yes," she said. "I believe he would." The years that followed were full in the way that good years are full, not without difficulty, because life in the Colorado Valley in the 1870s was never without its difficulties, but full of the kind of substance that difficulty and joy together create when they are processed by two people who have decided to face both honestly and together. Edward grew out of his suspicious expression around the age of 3, and into a child of considerable energy and even more considerable curiosity, who followed his mother around the office on the mornings she allowed it, and who followed his father around the ranch yard on the afternoons she did not, and who seemed to be constructing from these two experiences a comprehensive understanding of how things worked that Monroe privately thought was going to serve him very well. Augusta's practice grew in these years, because her reputation, already strong, deepened with each passing season and each case that came to her from further and further away. The Denver Medical Society, which had rejected her membership application in 1872, sent another letter in 1877. It was also framed, but this one went beside the first, because it was an offer of associate membership, which was not full membership and still fell short of what she deserved, but which she accepted because it opened access to medical journals and correspondence with other physicians that were valuable for her work, and because she was, as she told Monroe when it arrived, not interested in refusing things on principle when accepting them on practical grounds could benefit her patients. "That is very sensible," Monroe said. "I'm a very sensible person," she said. "You are," he agreed, "and also occasionally a very unreasonable one, and I value both qualities in you." She gave him a look that was severely trying not to be amused, which was one of his favorite looks she made. In 1878, when Edward was 2 years old and beginning to demonstrate a remarkable climbing ability that was aging both his parents at an accelerated rate, Calvin Trent called Monroe into the ranch house for a conversation that turned out to be a significant one. Calvin was 62 now, and showing it in the way that hard-working men of that era showed it, not in weakness but in a certain quietness that had settled around his edges, a drawing inward. He told Monroe that he was thinking of stepping back from the active management of the ranch, not completely, not yet, but gradually, and that he wanted to know whether Monroe would be interested in taking on more formal ownership interest, a partnership arrangement rather than a foreman's arrangement, which was something Calvin had been thinking about for 2 years and was now ready to make real. Monroe came home that evening and told Augusta about it, and they sat at the kitchen table long after Edward was asleep, and talked it through with the thoroughness that they brought to every major decision. And the thoroughness was one of the things Monroe loved about building a life with someone who thought clearly, because every significant choice got examined from every angle, and the resulting decision had the solidity of something that had been tested. The partnership was agreed to, and the formal papers were drawn up at the land office, and Monroe Barker's name went onto the deed of the Trent Ranch alongside Calvin Trent's, which was a moment that Monroe marked quietly and privately as one of the significant ones, not because of the property, but because of what it represented: the permanent choosing of a place, the declaration not just in feeling but in legal fact that this valley was where he belonged. He had known it since that November afternoon beside the creek. He knew it differently now, with the weight of years and work and the shared construction of a life behind it, but it was the same knowledge, clean and certain in the way that things are when they are true. Juniper Creek grew in the late 1870s, as the railroad inched closer to the valley, and the anticipation of its arrival brought new settlers and new commerce. The population rose toward 600 by 1879, and with it came new things: a second saloon, a proper hotel to replace the boarding house, a small newspaper, a schoolteacher from Ohio named Miss Charlotte Pierce, who was 23 and immediately became one of Augusta's patients, and eventually one of her close friends, which was notable because Augusta's close friends were not many but were chosen with the same care she brought to everything. Edward started school in 1881, at 5, and took to it with the ferocious enthusiasm of a child who has been paying close attention to how learning works by watching his mother work through medical problems and his father work through cattle problems, and who has concluded that the method is the same and that the method is worth mastering. Miss Pierce, who by 1881 had become Mrs. Pierce Aldridge following her marriage to the hotel owner, wrote Augusta a note in Edward's second month of school that said simply, "Your son asks more intelligent questions than any student I have taught. Please do not discourage this." Augusta read the note aloud to Monroe at breakfast, and he looked at his son across the table, who was currently conducting what appeared to be a structural analysis of his toast, and said, "Good morning, Edward. We hear you are asking good questions at school." Edward looked up. "I was wondering," he said, with the seriousness of someone delivering a considered position, "why the creek runs north when the mountain is south. It seems backward." Augusta and Monroe looked at each other across the table over the steam of their coffee, and Monroe reached across and took her hand as he often did in the mornings, the simple habitual gesture of two people whose togetherness has become the comfortable architecture of their days, and she squeezed his hand back, and they both looked at their son, who was wondering about watersheds at 5 years old, and Monroe thought, not for the first time and not for the last, that whatever combination of luck and good sense and blind fortunate timing had put him on the road to Juniper Creek on that June morning in 1874, he owed it something he could not calculate. "The mountain has two sides," Augusta told Edward, settling into the explanation with the focused clarity she brought to teaching, which she did frequently and well, because both her father and her own experience had taught her that explaining something carefully was one of the most important things you could do with knowledge. "The water flows away from the peak on both sides, and the side that faces north has a particular path cut through the rock over many thousands of years that brings it down into the valley where we can see it. The south side flows differently." Edward absorbed this. "So the creek is on the wrong side of the mountain," he concluded. "No," Augusta said. "The creek is exactly where it belongs. It just took a long time and a lot of rock to figure that out." She was looking at Edward when she said it, but Monroe, watching her, felt the words settle into him with a warmth that he recognized as one of those moments that seem ordinary and are not. He thought about the road to Juniper Creek, about the specific chain of decisions and chances, Calvin Trent's advertisement, Holt Mitchell's recommendation, a storm that spooked a horse at the right moment, A conversation he had no business listening to on a store porch, 2 cups of coffee and a stiff door hinge, and a letter framed on a wall that told him exactly who she was. The creek took a long time and a lot of rock to figure out where it belonged. Monroe had taken considerably less time than the creek, and he thought he had done considerably better. Their second child arrived in 1883, a boy they named James after Monroe's father, who had worked the Missouri farm with quiet dignity and had asked nothing of his children except that they be honest and useful. James was born in spring, which was a gentler start to a life than his brother's February entrance, and he arrived with considerably less of the ancestral indignation that had characterized Edward's first expressions, looking around at the world with a calm, brown-eyed interest that suggested he had been somewhere comfortable before, and found these new arrangements adequately satisfactory. Edward, 7 years old and firmly in possession of his position as the authority on all things in the Barker household that did not involve medicine or cattle, inspected his brother with the thoroughness of a professional and announced that he seemed adequate, and that he was prepared to teach him things when he was old enough to learn them. "That is very generous of you," Monroe said gravely. "I know," Edward agreed. Augusta, watching this exchange from her bed where Margaret Holt had firmly instructed her to remain for the next 3 days, despite her professional opinion that she was perfectly well, caught Monroe's eye across the room, and the look they exchanged contained the whole private language of 2 people who have been learning each other for 9 years and have reached the point where entire conversations happen in a glance. Margaret Holt, who was now 69 and had lost none of the sharp authority that had characterized her at 60, held James with the practiced ease of a woman who has held a great many babies over a great many years, and said that he looked like Augusta's mother, which made Augusta's face do something complicated and beautiful, because she had not known her mother well, Augusta Wainwright having died when Augusta was 6. And any resemblance that still lived in the next generation felt like a persistence of something that should not have been cut short so early. The valley in 1883 was a different place than it had been in 1874, changed in the way that Western settlements changed in those years, rapidly and sometimes ruthlessly, as the railroads approach, and then its arrival in the nearest town 20 miles south brought commerce and people and ambition, and all the complications that came with those things. There was more money in the valley now, and more people, and the particular character of a place where everyone knows everyone and watches out for the weaknesses in each other's fences was slowly acquiring the slightly more anonymous texture of a growing town. Not entirely. Juniper Creek retained enough of its original nature that Hazel Drummond still knew everyone's business, and was still the most efficient communication system in the county, that Raphael Esparza still rode the Barker-Trent land at 60, with the authority of someone who has been there longer than the fence posts, that Margaret Holt still occupied the central front pew of the church and held court at the social functions, with the unelected but completely acknowledged authority of the person who has been there the longest and has watched everyone grow up. But there were new names now, new families, and with them, inevitably, new medicine to practice, new cases Augusta had not encountered before, new children being born to new families that had come from places with different diseases and different histories, and she kept up with all of it the way she kept up with everything, through relentless reading and an absolute refusal to stop learning. She began, in 1884, to teach a young woman named Helen Burke, who was 20 years old and had come to Augusta as a patient, and stayed as an assistant and had shown, in the months of watching and helping, exactly the kind of mind and exactly the kind of temperament that Augusta recognized, because it was the temperament her father had recognized in her at the same age. She began teaching Helen as her father had taught her, thoroughly and seriously, with full expectation of equal results, and Helen proved as capable as the expectation demanded. "You are making yourself a replacement," Monroe said one evening, with a smile that showed he did not mean this critically. "I am making myself a colleague," Augusta corrected. "In 10 years this valley will have 2 doctors, one of whom I will have trained. I consider that a significant improvement on the current situation." "It is a significant improvement on most situations," he agreed. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the lamp. Then she said, "I think sometimes about the women who could have done what I do, who had the mind for it and the interest, but who were not fortunate enough to have a father who treated their education as seriously as their brothers might have been treated if they had had a brother. I cannot change that for them. But I can change it for Helen Burke, and perhaps for whoever Helen Burke teaches." Monroe looked at her in the lamplight, this woman he had been married to for 9 years and had been loving for 10, and thought that there was never going to be a point at which he finished being astonished by her. "I knew you were remarkable," he said, "from about the 4th Tuesday." She looked up at him with that smile, the full one, the one that had hid him behind the sternum in the December office and that still hid him there with faithful consistency. "You mentioned something of the kind," she said. "I was right," he said. "You frequently are," she said, returning to her reading but with the smile still present in her face, and Monroe sat across from her in their lamplight and listened to the house settle around them, and the mountain night come in quiet and cold through the walls, and James asleep in his small room and Edward asleep in his, and outside the window the stars that blazed over the Colorado Rockies at altitude, brilliant and particular and uncountable. He thought about the conversation he had overheard on that first morning, Hazel Drummond's voice carrying across the store porch, "Every woman in this valley is spoken for, every one except Augusta." He thought about the word exceptional without quite forming it, because exceptional was too thin a word for what had happened to him in this valley. What had happened was not exceptional. It was specific and particular and impossible to generalize. It was Augusta, exactly Augusta, and the life they had built that was unlike any life he had imagined when he was imagining his future, because he had not had the imagination to imagine something this good. He gave thanks for that, the imagining he had lacked, because if he had built the future in his mind ahead of arriving in it, it would have been smaller and less honest and would not have had her in it. Calvin Trent died in the spring of 1885, at the age of 69, which was a good long life by any reasonable accounting, and he went in his sleep in the house he had built himself 30 years before, which was the way he would have chosen if he had been choosing, quiet and in his own place. He left the ranch fully to Monroe, having no children of his own, with a letter to the attorney that said Monroe Barker had been the son he had not had and the best investment he had ever made in a human being, which Monroe received by sitting very still for a long time, and then going out to the fence line alone, and standing there looking at the mountains for an hour before coming back. Augusta gave him the same thing he had given her in the bunkhouse on a hard morning, the company of another person who understood that some things did not get better with words. She simply sat beside him that evening and let him be whatever he was, and he put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they sat with the loss together, until the loss found its right proportion in the larger shape of things. He buried Calvin in the valley cemetery beside the small creek, with the mountains at his back and the valley he had loved in front of him, and the whole of Juniper Creek turned out in the way it turned out for its own, because Calvin had been there since the beginning, and the beginning was worth honoring. The ranch was Monroe's now, fully and formally, and he ran it for the next years with the same focused honesty he had brought to everything in the valley, the crew changing and growing as the operation expanded. Billy Cope having turned into an excellent rancher himself by his late 20s, and now managing the eastern section with the easy competence of someone who has paid attention for long enough. Rafael Esparza finally slowing down in his mid-60s, but refusing to stop entirely, which Monroe respected and accommodated. Edward, at 12, could already ride with the competence that came from growing up around horses, and from the specific education of having a father who knew them as working partners rather than mere tools. And he had his mother's mind for understanding systems, and his father's patience for working with them. James, at 5, was the child who could be found sitting very still and watching things, a beetle crossing the yard, the way the wind moved through the grass in the pasture, the way Raphael's hands moved when he worked a piece of leather, and who would then attempt to reproduce what he had observed with a focused seriousness that was entirely his own. Augusta watched her sons growing up with the same attention she brought to all growing things, observing the changes and assessing them and keeping her assessments mostly to herself except when she discussed them with Monroe in the evenings, which was one of the great luxuries of a good marriage. She had discovered the ability to think out loud to someone who was genuinely interested in your thoughts. "Edward is going to want to go away to school," she said one evening in 1887, when Edward was 11. "Not yet, but in a few years. He needs more than what is available here." "He needs more than what is available in most places," Monroe said, which was accurate. "I'm not opposed to it," she said. "I want him to go where he can learn what he wants to learn, but I also want him to know that this is where he comes from and that it is worth coming from." "He knows," Monroe said. "He is proud of it." She nodded, satisfied. "He should be," she said. "It is a good place." "It is a very good place," Monroe agreed. He said it simply, the way he said everything true, and she reached across and put her hand over his on the table between them, and they sat in the warm kitchen light with the mountain evening coming down around the house and the sound of their boys asleep upstairs. And Monroe thought that if someone had told him in 1873, when he was 31 and drifting between jobs and places with no particular anchor, that in 10 years he would be sitting in this kitchen in this valley with this woman and these children and this life, he would not have been able to picture it. Not because it was beyond his hoping, but because it was beyond his imagination. He had needed to actually arrive in the valley to understand what the valley was. He had needed to actually meet Augusta to understand what a life beside her would be. He had needed to actually live the years to understand the value of them, which was perhaps the basic human situation, that the things most worth having cannot be properly understood until you have them, and the knowing arrives only in the having. He was grateful for that too, the not knowing before. Because the arrival had been something to live through rather than something to anticipate, and living it was better than anticipating it could ever have been. Edward went east for school in 1892, at 16, to a college preparatory academy in Colorado Springs, which was far enough to be away and close enough to come home for summers. And he came home those summers with more knowledge and more questions, and the same fundamental Edwardness that had characterized him since the suspicious moment of his February birth. And Monroe and Augusta received him each summer with the particular joy of parents who like their children as people, which is different from simply loving them, and is, in its way, the highest compliment. James, quieter and more interior, showed at 10 the particular talent for working with living things that became his defining characteristic, the horses and cattle of the ranch, and the medicinal plants his mother still collected and processed, and the general growing world of the valley, all receiving his particular focused, calm attention. And Augusta told Monroe one evening that she thought James had the makings of either a naturalist or a very patient farmer, and that either was a fine thing to be. Monroe agreed, because both were fine things to be, and because what he privately thought was that James had something his mother had, the capacity to be completely present with whatever was in front of him, which was rarer than most people recognized. The valley at the turn of the decade, at the end of the 1880s and moving toward the 1890s, was a different place than the Juniper Creek of 1874, larger and more connected to the wider world, with a proper school building now and a second physician working alongside Augusta, young Helen Burke, who was Dr. Burke now and running a parallel practice with the confident competence of someone well taught, and a post office and a bank and the railroad connection 20 miles south that had changed the economics of everything. The world was changing around the valley as the century moved toward its end, and the valley was changing with it. And some of what was changing was good, and some of it was complicated, and some of it was the particular injustice of a time and place that still held too many hierarchies too firmly. Augusta had patients who were Mexican families farming the south end of the valley, and native families who came from the mountain communities when the distance could be managed, and Chinese laborers from the railroad camp who had stayed in the region after their work was done. And all of them received from her the same quality of care, and the same directness, and the same honest assessment that she gave to the Anglo-ranching families who formed the majority of the town's population. This was not universally appreciated by all members of the town's establishment, and she knew it and cared about it the way she cared about the framed rejection letter on her wall, as information about other people's limitations rather than any reflection on herself or her patients. Monroe had a similar directness with his ranch crew, which was Mexican and Anglo, and in later years included 2 black cowhands who came up from Texas with a cattle drive and asked to stay, and were given the same terms and the same respect as anyone else on the land, which was not the universal practice in the valley, and was noticed both by those who approved of it and those who did not. "You are going to make enemies," Augusta told him, not as a warning but as an information delivery. "I have made enemies on less principled grounds," he said. "I can live with enemies made on this one." She looked at him with the look that was the private language. "Yes," she said simply, "you can." They were 50 approximately when the century turned. Monroe was 58 in 1900, and Augusta was 53. And the valley had grown to a proper small town of nearly 1,000 people, and their sons were men. Edward working as a teacher himself, now in Colorado Springs with a wife named Sarah, and a daughter named Eleanor after Augusta's mother, and James managing the ranch alongside Monroe with the quiet competence that had always been his character fully grown into its final form. Married to a woman named Ruth who was a farmer's daughter from the next valley, and who brought a direct practicality to the Barker household that sat comfortably alongside the existing directness that was the house's established tone. James and Ruth's first child, a boy born in 1899, was named Calvin Monroe Barker, which made Monroe sit very still for a moment when James told him the name they had chosen, and then made him stand up and walk out to the pasture and stand there for a while, which James watched him do with the understanding that comes from being someone's child for 31 years and knowing what certain silences mean. Augusta found him there eventually because she always found him eventually, and she stood beside him in the pasture with the mountains doing what they always did, rising in their permanent authority above the valley, the spring snow on the highest peaks brilliant in the afternoon sun. "Calvin Monroe," she said. "Good name," he managed. "Very good name," she agreed, and took his hand, and they stood in the pasture together while the spring moved through the valley and their grandson slept in the house behind them, and the land stretched out in the afternoon light. 800 acres of grass and stream and good grazing land that Calvin Trent had built and Monroe had kept, and that would pass now to James who would keep it too. And through him perhaps to young Calvin Monroe, who was currently 4 months old and had no opinions about property management yet, but would develop them in time. Monroe thought about luck. He thought about it regularly and had thought about it for 26 years, since the morning he rode into Juniper Creek and heard a conversation on a store porch that he had no business hearing. He thought about the specific chain of things: the storm, the horse, the ankle, the coffee, the creek in November, the December morning in the office and the small turquoise ring, and all the mornings after, the Tuesday and Thursday mornings that had become the architecture of a life. He thought he was probably the luckiest man in Colorado. He thought he was possibly the luckiest man he had ever met. He had ridden into a valley and found a woman who was, by the general accounting of the valley's residents, the last unmarried woman in it, which had been said as something between a puzzle and a sadness, but which had been, he now understood, simply a matter of waiting. She had been waiting, without knowing it, for the person who would see her completely and want exactly what was there. She had not been incomplete. She had been exactly herself, and exactly herself had not yet had the right company. He had been the right company. He had known it from about the fourth Tuesday, and he had been right about it, which he considered the most important correct assessment of his life. "What are you thinking about?" Augusta asked beside him, her voice carrying the warmth of a woman who is comfortable in silence but interested in ending it if something worth saying is available. "How fortunate I am," he said. She was quiet for a moment, the mountains doing their patient work in front of them. "So am I," she said. "I think about it. Not always in those terms, because I do not think I entirely believed in luck before I met you. I thought outcomes were the result of decision-making, and that fortune was a story people told themselves." She paused. "But I have come to believe that the day you rode into this valley was fortunate in a way that goes beyond decision-making. It was the right person arriving at the right time. I do not know what to call that except fortunate." "Lucky stars," Monroe said. She looked at him sideways with the smile that still, after all these years, arrived in him with the same impact. "Lucky stars," she agreed. Behind them, from the house, Ruth's voice called something to James in the warm domestic tenor of a household in its comfortable afternoon. And in the distance, a horse moved in the far pasture with the particular sound of something completely at home in its element. And the spring light lay over the valley in the way that spring light does in high places, slanted and clean, and full of the specific clarity of altitude. Monroe squeezed Augusta's hand, and she squeezed back, the same gesture of 1,000 mornings and 1,000 evenings. The conversation that had no need of words because it had been having itself in every silence for 26 years, and had nothing left to prove, and nowhere left to go except forward, into the further years that the valley would give them. Full of coffee and work and their sons' lives and their grandsons' growing, and the patients that still came to the office at the end of the main street, and were received by Dr. Burke now primarily, but sometimes still by Dr. Wainwright, who kept the name she had always been, and would be for as long as there were patients who needed what she knew. The office door had a good hinge. It had had a good hinge since the autumn of 1874, when Monroe Barker had fixed it without announcement, and in the small ways of maintained things it still held, as the house held and the ranch held, and the valley held them both in the wide particular beauty of a place that had become exactly home. The creek still ran north, working its ancient way through the rock along the path it had carved over thousands of years, finding the route that was always there waiting for it, and the mountains rose above it in their permanent indifference to anything as brief as a human lifetime. And in the valley between them, the town of Juniper Creek went on being what it was, full and small and particular and entirely real. And Monroe Barker, who had ridden in on a June morning in 1874, knowing only that he had a job to do and no idea what else the valley held, stood in his pasture on a spring afternoon in 1900 with his wife's hand in his and his grandson sleeping in his house and his sons nearby, and the whole accumulated substance of a life well and honestly lived around him, and thanked. In the quiet, ongoing way of someone who has been thinking for long enough that it has become simply the texture of how he moves through each day, the lucky stars that had put him exactly here. He had been, perhaps, the right person at the right time for her. But she had been, without question, the making of the best version of him, the thing that gave the wandering a destination, the thing that made the valley a home rather than a stop, the thing that turned a life lived competently and alone into a life lived fully and beside someone who was, in every morning and every evening and every difficult day between them, exactly worth the finding.